The 1950s were supposed to be America's golden age of pickup trucks, tough, proud, and built to last. But behind the shiny grills and patriotic ads lay a darker truth. Many of these trucks were mechanical traps, unstable, underbraked, poorly balanced, and often lethal. They were sold to farmers, laborers, and families under the promise of reliability. But on the road, they handled like runaway farm equipment. Safety didn't exist back then. There were no crash standards, no roll cages, and no mercy for drivers who trusted the marketing. These were machines built with ignorance, arrogance, and cost-cutting, and they claimed countless lives through steering failures, brake collapses, and rollovers that snapped steel like kindling. Here are the 11 worst pickup trucks of the 1950s, the ones that looked like American strength, but drove like suicide missions. Dear viewer, we have set a goal of reaching 30,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and we would love for you to join us. Thank you for your support. Number 11. The 1955 Chevrolet Task Force 3100. At first glance, this truck looked like the embodiment of progress. It had a wide chrome grille, integrated fenders, and a panoramic wraparound windshield, a far cry from the boxy utilitarian trucks of the early 1950s. Chevrolet called it modern, bold, and strong enough for any job. And visually, it was. But underneath that stylish sheet metal lay a dangerous truth, one that claimed lives on America's backroads and farms. The Task Force 3100 used recirculating ball steering, which wasn't unusual for its time. But Chevrolet's system had a critical flaw: the steering box. It was poorly sealed and prone to losing lubrication. As grease dried up, internal bushings wore down. Over time, this wear caused the steering gear to bind and, in extreme cases, lock up entirely during turns. Imagine driving a heavy, fully loaded truck down a mountain road, turning into a curve, and suddenly the steering wheel refuses to move. This was not theoretical. It happened often enough that rural newspapers across the Midwest and Appalachia reported fatal wrecks attributed to loss of steering control in these models. Farmers and ranchers who used these trucks daily were particularly vulnerable. Once the wheel froze, there was no regaining control, and combined with narrow dirt roads and steep grades, rollovers were almost inevitable. The task force still used a single-circuit drum brake system. In simple terms, this meant all four wheels shared one hydraulic line. If that line developed a leak, even a small one, the entire braking system failed. This design flaw wasn't unique to Chevrolet, but the weight of the truck made it especially deadly. When the system failed, the heavy front end and stiff suspension made emergency downshifting or handbrake maneuvers nearly useless. Countless owners described runaway scenarios on hills or highways. One small leak, and there was no way to stop 2 tons of rolling metal. It wasn't until the late 1960s that dual-circuit brakes became standard industry-wide, largely to prevent disasters like those that befell the task force. The Task Force series also had poor rollover protection. With its tall cab, narrow track width, and high center of gravity, the 3100 flipped easily when a driver tried to correct a steering lock. And because seatbelts were not yet standard equipment, ejections were common. Contemporary reports from insurance investigators noted that a significant portion of single-vehicle rollovers involving these trucks resulted in fatal head trauma or crushing injuries. Many of these crashes happened at relatively low speeds, rural work roads, hillsides, or even turns into driveways. The 1955 Task Force 3100 stands today as a lesson in misplaced priorities. It symbolized the shift towards styling and consumer appeal over engineering robustness. Chevrolet engineers focused on looks and comfort, things like a chrome-laden dash, optional radio and wraparound glass, but failed to modernize the steering and brake systems that kept drivers alive. By the late 1950s, GM quietly improved lubrication systems and reinforced steering gears, but by then the task force's reputation in rural America was tarnished. This truck's legacy is a sobering reminder: in the pursuit of beauty and marketing appeal, safety often came last, and it cost lives. The 1955 Chevrolet Task Force 3100 wasn't just another old pickup. It was a symbol of a transitional era in American automotive history, a time when manufacturers began to chase aesthetics and sales figures rather than the mechanical reliability that working people depended on. Its design flaws, steering lockups, brake failures, and rollover risks turned what should have been a dependable farm truck into a machine that demanded constant vigilance from its driver. Today, we can look back and appreciate its bold design, but we must also remember the price paid by those who trusted it with their lives. Number 10. The 1953 Ford F-100. It's the pickup that defined Ford's post-war design language, celebrated by collectors for its bold grille, rounded fenders, and unmistakable stance. But behind its handsome looks and nostalgic charm lurks a darker reality. The F-100 was one of the most dangerous work trucks ever built, a machine that could kill its driver just as easily as it could haul a load of lumber. The 1953 model year marked the debut of Ford's second-generation F-Series, a redesign meant to modernize America's favorite pickup. Ford gave it a wider cab, a one-piece windshield, and a choice of cost clipper V8 or straight-six engines. It looked new, tough, and trustworthy, but it was far from safe. Underneath the new sheet metal, Ford engineers made one critical mistake. They sacrificed structural reinforcement to reduce weight and increase production efficiency. The F-100's cab relied on thin-gauge steel panels welded together without internal bracing. In a frontal collision, that structure folded almost instantly, leaving the driver exposed to the full force of impact. Tests conducted years later by independent restorers and safety analysts showed that even a 30-mile-per-hour head-on crash could crumple the firewall and push the steering column directly into the driver's chest, a scenario that earned the F-100 the grim nickname, the Steel Coffin. One of the most lethal design features of the 1953 F-100 was its solid steering shaft. Unlike modern collapsible designs, which absorb crash energy and deflect away from the driver, the F-100's column acted like a spear in a collision. When the front frame rails buckled, the steering box transmitted that motion straight into the cab and straight into the driver. There were documented cases from state highway patrols and rural newspapers describing fatal wrecks in which the steering wheel literally impaled the chest of drivers, often during relatively low-speed impacts. In an era before seatbelts or padded dashboards, there was simply no protection. If the structure and steering weren't enough of a hazard, the brakes sealed the F-100's deadly reputation. The truck used all-drum brakes with a single hydraulic circuit, meaning that one fluid leak could cause total brake failure. Even when functioning properly, the drums were notorious for fade, the loss of stopping power when heat built up during repeated use. On long downhill grades, especially with a loaded bed, the F-100's brakes could lose effectiveness within minutes. Drivers often had to rely on engine braking or even scraping the truck against a guardrail to stop it. Many rural drivers learned this lesson the hard way, some fatally, when the brakes faded to nothing on mountain descents. The 1953 F-100's flat bench seat and rigid steel dashboard offered no impact cushioning. Its doors could burst open during collisions, ejecting passengers onto the road. And because the truck rode on bias-ply tires with poor wet traction, loss of control was common, especially on rain-slick highways. Combine these elements: weak structure, spear-like steering shaft, fading brakes, and bad tires, and you had a perfect storm. A seemingly slow-speed accident could become instantaneously fatal. Yet Ford, like most automakers of the time, made no mention of these risks in its marketing. The ads of 1953 showed smiling farmers, confident salesmen, and slogans like "Ford trucks cost less to run and last longer." There was no hint that a hard front-end impact could make that longer tragically short. It's important to remember the 1950s were an era before federal safety standards. There were no crumple zones, no seat belts, and no crash testing requirements. Engineers designed vehicles for performance and cost, not survivability. The F-100's failings weren't unique, but they were amplified by its sheer popularity. Ford sold hundreds of thousands of them, putting a deadly design into the hands of everyday Americans. On farms, construction sites, and highways across the nation, the F-100 became both a symbol of progress and a silent killer. Today, the 1953 Ford F-100 is a collector's icon, lovingly restored, polished, and displayed at car shows across the country. But when enthusiasts call it a real truck, they often forget that its toughness was an illusion. Modern automotive engineers study vehicles like the F-100 to understand how unreinforced cabs and rigid components behave in crashes. Its deadly flaws helped inspire the eventual introduction of collapsible steering columns, 1967, padded dashboards, and energy-absorbing body structures. In other words, countless lives were lost before the industry learned that beauty and strength mean nothing without safety. The 1953 Ford F-100 may be remembered as one of the most iconic American pickups ever built, but history demands a harsher truth. It was a steel coffin on wheels, a reminder that automotive design without safety is a betrayal of the very people who trust their lives behind the wheel. Its story is a monument to both innovation and ignorance, and a solemn lesson in how progress sometimes comes only after tragedy. Number 9. The 1951 Dodge B-Series pickup. Marketed as rugged, dependable, and job-rated, this truck became a staple of farms, small businesses, and rural highways. But beneath its bold claims and blue-collar charm lay a vehicle that was mechanically fragile, structurally treacherous, and fatally unsafe. The B-Series wasn't merely a flawed truck. It was, in many respects, a rolling hazard, designed in an era when durability was measured in horsepower, not human life. The Dodge B-Series debuted in 1948 and continued through 1953, bridging the gap between pre-war engineering and the emerging modern truck era. The 1951 model looked handsome enough: a simple, rounded cab, integrated fenders, and a distinctive pilot house cab with larger windows for visibility. But beneath that smooth styling hid engineering negligence that would claim countless lives. Dodge engineers prioritized simplicity and cost efficiency over safety and reliability. The truck was powered by Chrysler's long-running flathead inline-six engine, a design already 2 decades old. It produced decent torque for its size, around 95 horsepower, but had one fatal flaw: chronic overheating. The cooling system, undersized for heavy loads or summer driving, often failed to dissipate heat fast enough. The result? Engines that seized mid-drive, locking up the rear wheels and causing instant loss of control. On highways or descending grades, such sudden lockups turned into high-speed spins, rollovers, or collisions that left drivers with no chance to react. The 1951 B Series had another deadly weak point: its steering linkages. Dodge's steering design relied on a network of thin rods and joints that were prone to metal fatigue, especially under the stresses of rough roads or front-end impacts. Farmers and truckers of the 1950s learned, often too late, that the pitman arm or tie rod ends could snap without warning. When that happened, the front wheels went their own direction and the truck went wherever gravity decided. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, founded years later, would cite early 1950s Dodge trucks as examples of pre-safety era steering failures that caused loss of directional control, resulting in multiple fatalities. One story, recorded in a 1952 Kansas State Patrol report, described a farmer whose B Series suddenly veered off a bridge into a ravine after the steering arm fractured. The cause? Metal fatigue from normal operation. Perhaps the most horrifying design decision of all was Dodge's fuel tank placement. In the B Series, the gasoline tank sat directly behind the driver's seat, inside the cab. It was separated from the occupant's back by little more than a sheet of thin steel. In theory, this layout saved space and simplified fuel line routing. In practice, it was a time bomb. In rear-end collisions, even at low speed, the tank could rupture or the filler neck could shear off, spilling gasoline directly into the cab. Many surviving accident reports describe fires that engulfed the cabin within seconds, leaving drivers trapped by jammed doors or unconscious from the impact. The seat padding and vinyl upholstery only fed the flames. Decades later, safety experts would compare this setup to the infamous Ford Pinto of the 1970s, noting that Dodge had pioneered the same deadly idea 20 years earlier. The 1951 Dodge B Series pickup looked tough: heavy steel fenders, thick panels, and a frame designed for hauling. But its crash behavior told another story. The cab was mounted directly to the frame, with no energy absorption points. In collisions, all impact forces transferred straight to the cabin. When the truck's front end hit an obstacle, the steering column and dashboard acted like blunt instruments, crushing anyone seated inside. The rigid bench seat offered no restraint, and of course, seat belts didn't exist. The truck's doors often sprung open during crashes, ejecting passengers into the road or under the vehicle's own tires. Survivors of such wrecks were rare, not because of speed or recklessness, but because the B Series offered zero survivability by design. To understand how such a flawed vehicle came to market, we must look at the mindset of the early 1950s. The war was over, factories were booming, and safety was simply not a concern. The automotive industry measured success in production numbers, not protection ratings. Truck buyers in particular were told they needed strength and simplicity. The phrase "job-rated," Dodge's marketing slogan, implied a machine built for hard work, not human comfort. What it really meant was a cost-cut design that prioritized payloads over people. And in the absence of federal safety standards, there was no accountability. Fatalities were written off as driver error, even when the cause was mechanical failure or structural collapse. Today, the 1951 Dodge B Series pickup is a collector's favorite, restored, repainted, and paraded as a symbol of America's golden industrial age. But history tells a darker truth. This was a truck that could betray its driver at any moment. Its overheating engine, fragile steering, and explosive fuel tank make it a textbook example of pre-safety engineering negligence. The lessons learned from disasters like the B-Series would later influence critical developments such as dual-circuit brake systems, energy-absorbing steering columns, crash-resistant fuel tank placement, and reinforced cab structures. It took decades and thousands of lives for these principles to become standard. The 1951 Dodge B-Series pickup represents a turning point in American automotive history, not because of innovation, but because of its deadly oversights. It was a truck that looked honest but hid fatal flaws beneath its job-rated badge. It overheated, it failed, it burned, and it killed. But from its failures came lessons that would ultimately save lives in generations of trucks that followed. The next time someone calls the B-Series a real truck, remember, it was real in the worst possible way. A real threat, built in an era when toughness meant everything and safety meant nothing. Number 8. The 1957 GMC Blue Chip 100. Advertised as professional grade and precision engineered for the toughest jobs, this pickup was anything but safe. Beneath its bold chrome grille and proud GMC lettering lay a deeply flawed suspension system, primitive steering, and a dangerous weight imbalance that made high-speed driving a gamble with fate. The Blue Chip 100 wasn't just another 1950s pickup, it was a case study in how style and marketing overtook safety and mechanical balance, turning a work tool into a death trap. By 1957, GMC's Blue Chip line was nearing the end of its production run, 1955 through 1959. Sharing its basic structure and body shell with the Chevrolet Task Force trucks. GMC's ads boasted professional-grade engineering and the toughest truck in the field. Under the hood sat the GMC Inline 6, typically the 270 or 302 cubic inch engine. Big, heavy power plants built more for brute torque than finesse. The engine's cast-iron block added nearly 700 pounds to the truck's nose, giving it a dangerously front-heavy weight distribution. Now pair that with a front suspension that was little more than a carryover from pre-war designs, a straight axle with semi-elliptic leaf springs, and you had the perfect formula for what drivers called the death dance. Every bump, rut, or pothole transferred directly into the steering wheel, jerking it violently in the driver's hands. This phenomenon, known as bump steer, meant that the truck could change direction without driver input. At 50 or 60 miles per hour, a small dip in the pavement could send the Blue Chip veering toward the ditch, oncoming traffic, or a telephone pole. Let's break down the heart of the problem. The under-designed front suspension geometry. GMC engineers had attempted to give the Blue Chip a smoother ride than earlier advanced design models, but instead of adopting independent front suspension, as Ford was experimenting with, they relied on slightly softened leaf springs and a lower mounting angle. This change amplified lateral motion. The front wheels could move vertically without maintaining a consistent steering angle. On paper, this was a minor compromise. In practice, it was catastrophic. At high speeds, especially when carrying a light rear load, the front end would hunt for center. The steering box, slow and heavily geared, forced the driver into overcorrections, which the stiff suspension then exaggerated. The result was a violent oscillation, a back-and-forth sway that could end in a complete rollover. GMC's heavy front end only worsened this, as the inertia of the inline 6 caused the nose to dive and rebound unpredictably. Drivers on rural highways described it as trying to steer a bull on roller skates. Between 1956 and 1959, numerous accident reports from state patrols, particularly in mountain regions and the rural Midwest, referenced GMC pickups losing control on uneven pavement or departing the roadway without braking. One 1958 Nebraska Highway Patrol report noted truck swerved abruptly upon encountering rough shoulder. Vehicle overturned twice, killing both occupants. The cause listed: front suspension failure and steering instability. In an era before power steering or collapsible columns, when you lost control in a blue chip, you didn't just crash, you suffered. When the truck rolled, the rigid cab structure transmitted the full weight of the roof onto occupants. The thin roof pillars folded like cardboard, and the non-retracting steering column became a spear. There were no seatbelts, no energy absorption, and no chance. GMC's inline-six engines were praised for durability, but cursed for their weight and torque imbalance. In the Blue Chip 100, the engine sat high and forward on the chassis, ahead of the front axle line. That placement made the truck plow-happy, prone to understeering and nosediving under braking. When the driver hit the brakes hard, the front end dug into the road surface, transferring dangerous loads through the tires and springs. The combination of weight and poor suspension meant the truck's stability margin was razor-thin. A pothole, a gravel shoulder, or a misjudged curve could easily flip the vehicle. And when that happened, the truck's steel dashboard, unreinforced doors, and rigid bench seat offered no protection whatsoever. By 1957, America's pickup truck market was shifting. No longer just farm tools, pickups were becoming lifestyle vehicles. Chevrolet and GM introduced two-tone paint, panoramic windshields, and chrome-laden grills. The Blue Chip series embodied that transition, a stylish face masking an outdated chassis. GMC wanted to compete with Ford's F-Series and Dodge's Power Giant, but rather than redesigning its suspension, it focused on aesthetics and marketing. The Blue Chip name itself was chosen to evoke financial reliability, as if buying one was an investment. Yet for many families, it was an investment that ended in tragedy. Without federal crash standards, companies like GMC could advertise professional-grade safety with no accountability. The result was a truck that looked advanced but behaved like a relic from the 1930s. The 1957 GMC Blue Chip 100 stands as a haunting reminder of how engineering arrogance and marketing spin can cost lives. Its lethal combination of front-heavy weight, archaic suspension, and zero crash protection made it one of the most dangerous pickups of its era. By the early 1960s, GMC would finally introduce independent front suspension and dual-circuit brakes, but for thousands of blue-chip drivers, those changes came too late. Collectors today restore these trucks for shows, admiring their chrome and curves. But beneath that gleaming paint lies the soul of a machine that couldn't keep itself on the road. The 1957 GMC Blue Chip 100 promised precision and professionalism, but delivered chaos and catastrophe. Its unstable front suspension made it unpredictable, its heavy engine made it nose-heavy, and its structural rigidity ensured that rollovers were almost always fatal. It was a truck that demanded respect and punished anyone who underestimated it. So the next time someone calls it a professional-grade classic, remember, in 1957, that phrase didn't mean safe or strong. It meant a truck built for work, not survival. A beautiful killer born in an age before the word safety meant anything. Number 7. The 1950 Studebaker 2R5 pickup. At first glance, it looked modern and sleek for its time. Studebaker's post-war designers wanted something fresh, something that screamed optimism after years of war and austerity. The result was a pickup that looked almost too elegant for farm work. It had a cab-forward stance, a rounded nose, and that trademark bullet-like front profile that made it look futuristic compared to the boxy Fords and Chevrolets of the day. But underneath that stylish sheet metal, a mechanical setup that would later prove deadly. Studebaker's engineers tried to create a lightweight, affordable pickup, but the compromises stacked up fast. The Loadmaster hydraulic braking system was underpowered even when brand new. The front drums were too small to handle heavy loads or repeated stops on steep grades. Drivers in hilly areas quickly learned that once those drums heated up, you were on your own. Brake fade was severe. In some cases, you could press the pedal to the floor and feel almost nothing. Then there was the narrow track width, only about 55 inches up front, compared to wider domestic competitors. That might sound minor, but in a tall, unloaded pickup with a high center of gravity, it was catastrophic. When you combined a narrow stance with stiff rear leaf springs, the truck became dangerously tip-prone during emergency maneuvers. Even at moderate speeds, say 40 to 45 miles per hour, a sudden swerve to avoid an obstacle could make the 2R5 lift a wheel, then roll completely over. Owners recalled it feeling light on its feet, but that wasn't a compliment, it was a warning. The Studebaker 2R5's real terror began once it hit rural American roads. At the time, highways were narrow and uneven, with ruts, gravel shoulders, and unbanked curves. Add a loaded bed, say a few hundred pounds of tools or crops, and the truck's weight distribution went haywire. The front end stayed light, while the back sagged, changing how the brakes and steering reacted. When drivers tried to correct a fishtail or dodge a pothole at highway speed, the combination of weak brakes, narrow stance, and top-heavy balance often flipped the pickup violently. Eyewitnesses described them tumbling like tin toys, scattering tools and cargo in every direction. Those who survived often crawled out dazed and bloodied if they weren't crushed by the thin cab structure. Seatbelts weren't even optional then, and the steering column was rigid steel, a deadly spear in frontal impacts. The Studebaker 2R5 was powered by Studebaker's trusty 170 cubic inch Champion Inline-6, a carryover engine from their passenger cars. While reasonably efficient, it was underpowered for truck duty. The engine had to strain to haul even moderate loads, and with its long stroke design, it vibrated heavily under load. The clutch and gearbox weren't much better, both light-duty carryovers that wore out quickly in work use. The mechanical fatigue from constant overworking often caused axle failures and cracked spring mounts, further reducing handling stability. Studebaker sold the 2R series as modern motoring for the working man. In truth, it was a case of form over function, a beautiful body concealing serious safety flaws. The company's financial struggles didn't help. They lacked the budget for full-scale suspension redesigns or brake upgrades, and instead relied on styling refreshes to boost sales. By the early 1950s, word spread among rural buyers. Pretty truck, bad manners. Dealers in the Midwest and South reported trade-ins after only a year or two of use, sometimes after a rollover scare or brake failure. Today, collectors praise the 2R5 for its design purity, that graceful cab, the simplicity of its lines, and its role in post-war optimism. But enthusiasts know the truth. It's one of the most dangerous vintage pickups to actually drive. It stands as a cautionary tale from an era before safety engineering mattered, when companies sold dreams, not durability. The 1950 Studebaker 2R5 may look like a piece of Americana, but behind the chrome and charm lies a history written in bent steel, broken glass, and the sobering reminder that beauty doesn't always mean safety. Number 6. The 1958 Ford F-250, the pickup that couldn't stay straight. In the late 1950s, Ford was on a mission. America's economy was booming, the suburbs were expanding, and pickup trucks were no longer just for farmers. They were becoming symbols of modern working-class pride. To stand out, Ford promised innovation, strength, durability. The truck that works like a car, their ads said. But what they actually built in 1958 was a pickup that couldn't even stay in its own lane. The Ford F-250, a truck whose very suspension design made it one of the most unpredictable machines of its time. A false revolution, the twin I-beam concept. Let's start with the engineering story. Ford's engineers believed they had revolutionized truck suspension design. They introduced what they proudly called the twin I-beam front suspension, two long forged steel beams that pivoted independently from the frame, allowing each wheel to move separately over bumps. On paper, this sounded brilliant. Smoother rides, less body roll, better comfort. In reality, it was a geometry nightmare. The twin I-beam created extreme camber changes as the suspension moved. That meant when one wheel hit a bump, it didn't just go up and down, it tilted inward or outward, changing the angle of the tire against the road. At high speeds or under heavy loads, this caused severe bump steer, where the truck would suddenly dart left or right without driver input. It felt as though the truck had its own mind. Weight imbalance and dangerous dynamics. Now add to that an already poor front-to-rear weight balance. The F-250 carried most of its mass in the front thanks to its massive engine and heavy front axle, while the bed was relatively light unless fully loaded. That imbalance created a deadly combination. When the truck was empty, the light rear tires lost traction easily, especially on wet or dirt roads. The moment a driver hit a puddle or a patch of gravel, the rear end could snap sideways violently. When it was loaded, things got even worse. The high center of gravity, combined with the flexing twin I-beam suspension, made the F-250 prone to body sway and fishtailing at highway speeds. If the rear started to swing, it was nearly impossible to recover, particularly with the slow, vague steering box Ford used at the time. Drivers who tried to correct oversteer often found themselves in an uncontrollable tank slapper, ending with the truck flipping onto its roof or rolling into ditches. The late 1950s were a deadly era for drivers. No seat belts, no crumple zones, no rollover protection. But even by those standards, the 1958 F-250 was unusually treacherous. On wet asphalt, rear tires could break loose under mild throttle. On gravel roads, a sharp turn could trigger an instant fishtail. And with that tall, narrow stance, once the truck began to roll, it rarely stopped at a single rotation. Rural accident reports from the period often tell the same story. Lost control while hauling a load. Rolled several times on County Route 12. Vehicle overturned, steering locked mid-turn. Ford had claimed its new suspension reduced maintenance and improved safety. But the truth? It was an unpredictable pendulum of steel that punished anyone who dared to drive it aggressively or carelessly. You might ask, if the design was so dangerous, why did Ford keep it? The answer? Marketing and cost. The twin I-beam setup was cheaper to manufacture than independent front suspension and easier to align on the assembly line. Ford's ads boasted of its car-like comfort and truck-tough strength, and customers bought into the promise. For decades, Ford doubled down, refining but never fully abandoning the twin I-beam design. Even in later models, it became infamous for chewing through front tires and causing erratic handling under load. Mechanics joked that you don't align a Ford truck, you compromise with it. For the everyday American worker of 1958, the F-250 was more than a vehicle. It was a livelihood. Farmers, tradesmen, and delivery drivers relied on it. But that dependence came at a price. One misjudged curve or unexpected rainstorm could turn a routine drive into a deadly spin-out. The combination of poor weight distribution, twitchy suspension geometry, and slow manual steering made survival often a matter of luck. And in the days before seat belts or collapsible steering columns, many drivers were thrown through windshields or crushed by the cab when the truck rolled. It was a grim irony, a professional-grade workhorse that betrayed the very people it was built for. The 1958 Ford F-250 stands today as a symbol of engineering overconfidence, when innovation outpaced testing and bold claims masked serious flaws. Ford would continue refining the F-Series, eventually turning it into America's most successful truck line. But the ghosts of the late 1950s models still linger. The ones that taught automakers that comfort means nothing if the vehicle can't stay on the road. The 1958 F-250 promised strength and stability. What it delivered, far too often, was chaos and tragedy. Number 5. The 1954 International Harvester R110. It's easy to be fooled by its rugged charm. The tall fenders, the proud hood emblem, the square, honest cab. Everything about it screamed dependability. It was built, as International boasted, for farmers by farmers. But that slogan hid a bitter irony. The same truck that was supposed to save rural America ended up killing many of the men who depended on it. Because beneath that sturdy skin lay an outdated, under-tested machine, one that could neither stop safely nor steer reliably. And when things went wrong, the driver's strength and prayers were all that stood between him and the grave. By 1954, International Harvester, IH, had carved out a unique identity. Unlike Ford or Chevrolet, IH didn't chase suburban buyers or shiny showrooms. Their market was the field, not the freeway. They built trucks for people who plowed, hauled, and worked sunup to sundown. The R-Series, introduced in the early 1950s, was meant to modernize their lineup. The R110 was the half-ton model, simple, honest, and seemingly indestructible. But the design philosophy was decades behind the competition. IH engineers prioritized durability and payload over drivability. What they created was a truck that could haul 1,500 pounds of hay, but couldn't stop safely on a downhill grade. At the heart of the problem were the undersized drum brakes. They were narrow, made of cheap cast iron, and completely unvented. On flat land, they worked adequately, but once the truck started down a long hill, especially with a load in the bed, friction turned deadly. The brake drums overheated within minutes, causing what's known as brake fade. At first, the pedal just felt softer. Then, suddenly, it went straight to the floor. On gravel roads, there was no shoulder to bail out onto, only ditches, fences, and trees. Many farmers found themselves pumping the pedal frantically as the R110 gained speed, its brakes glowing red and useless. The official term was loss of control. The truth was simpler. The brakes melted. And unlike modern systems, this truck had a single-circuit hydraulic brake line, meaning if even one wheel cylinder leaked or boiled, the entire system failed. One crack in a hose, one leaky fitting, and you had no brakes. None. Even if you managed to keep it under control, the steering was its own kind of torture. The R110 used a manual, recirculating ball steering box with a pitman arm so stiff that even experienced drivers dreaded parallel parking it. At low speeds, it felt like turning a concrete mixer without power assist. On uneven roads, it demanded full physical strength just to stay centered. And on rural highways with sudden turns or wandering livestock, that delay between steering input and front-wheel response often meant the difference between a close call and a rollover. Imagine trying to steer a fully loaded truck with both hands white-knuckled on a giant wheel while your foot is pressed to a brake pedal that no longer works. That was the 1954 International Harvester R110 driving experience. By the early 1950s, small towns across America, many rural deaths were politely recorded as driver fatigue. The story always sounded the same. The truck left the road after a long workday. But when you dig deeper, the evidence points elsewhere. Witnesses reported smoking brake drums, locked steering, and runaway trucks barreling downhill. The fatigue wasn't from lack of sleep, it was from wrestling a machine that fought its driver every mile. Farmers, loggers, and delivery men, the people IH promised to serve, were being killed not by exhaustion, but by engineering negligence. Part of what made the R110 so dangerous was the illusion of its toughness. International Harvester trucks were built like tanks, thick steel cabs, heavy frames, rigid axles. But that rigidity was double-edged. In a crash, there were no crumple zones, just raw steel transmitting force straight into the cabin. Steering columns didn't collapse, dashboards were solid metal, seat belts weren't even an option. When an R110 rolled, and they often did, the cab simply crushed inward like a press. Survivability in a rollover or frontal collision was virtually zero. So why didn't International Harvester improve the brakes or lighten the steering? The answer lies in their customer base. Farmers were seen as practical men, tough, loyal, and unlikely to complain. If something broke, they fixed it. If the brakes failed, they assumed it was their fault. IH Marketing exploited that mindset. They sold the R110 as a real man's truck, implying that if it was hard to drive, that just proved it was built for the strong. But what they were really doing was masking flawed design with masculine pride. Today, the 1954 International Harvester R110 lives on in farm museums and vintage truck shows. Collectors restore them lovingly, celebrating their durability and old-school simplicity. But that nostalgia hides a darker truth. These trucks worked too hard and killed too many. They represented an era before crash testing, before ergonomics, before engineers cared about how fatigue or brake fade could destroy lives. The R110 didn't fail because farmers were careless. It failed because International Harvester underestimated physics. The 1954 International Harvester R110 reminds us that strength without safety is a false virtue. It was a truck built for endurance, but not for survival. It taught us, tragically, that making a machine heavier doesn't make it safer, and that toughness is meaningless when the driver must pray to stay alive. For every farmer who lost his life behind that oversized steering wheel, the R110 remains a silent monument to a truth automakers long ignored. If a machine can't protect its operator, it doesn't matter how strong it is. Number 4. The 1952 Willys pickup, a Jeep that should have stayed on the battlefield. When Americans saw the 1952 Willys pickup, they saw something familiar, rugged, upright, and patriotic. It looked like a working man's machine, descended from the heroic Jeep that helped win World War II. But behind that brave face was a deadly illusion. The Willys pickup wasn't a reinvention of the war-proven Jeep, it was an overgrown copy of it. And what worked on a muddy battlefield at 25 miles per hour didn't work on an American highway at 55. Lightweight, underpowered, and dangerously unstable, this truck turned everyday driving into a gamble with gravity. The birth of a civilian legend and its dangerous descendant. After the war, Willys Overland wanted to cash in on its Jeep reputation. Americans trusted the Jeep. It was a symbol of freedom, reliability, and toughness. So, Willys engineers decided to stretch and adapt that same basic Jeep frame into a light-duty pickup for farmers and tradesmen. The Willys 4x4 pickup, introduced in 1947 and refined through the early 1950s, shared nearly all its DNA with the wartime MB and CJ models. The same narrow track width, the same short wheelbase proportions, and the same flat ladder-type frame designed for off-road crawling, not stability. It was cheap, simple, and easy to maintain, but dangerously unsuited to the faster, heavier post-war roads of the 1950s. By the 1952 model year, when other trucks were gaining wider stances, power steering, and better brakes, the Willys pickup still handled like a farm implement. Underpowered, yet unstable. The 1952 Willys pickup was powered by the Go Devil 124 cubic inch four-cylinder engine, an engine that had earned its stripes in wartime Jeeps. It was reliable, yes, but it made barely 63 horsepower and only about 105 pound-feet of torque. That would have been fine for dirt trails, but when paired with the pickup's 2,900-pound body and stiff suspension, it created a paradox: too little power to accelerate safely onto roads, but too little weight to hold the rear end steady once it did. The result was a truck that could barely reach 55 miles per hour, yet became wildly unstable if it ever did. The Willys rear axle carried almost no weight when unladen. Without cargo, the rear tires barely gripped the road. On slick pavement or gravel, even a small tap on the brake pedal could send the back end fishtailing. Drivers described it as riding a skittish mule. Once it started to swing, there was no bringing it back. A fatal flaw: brake imbalance. The braking system was primitive even by early 1950 standards. It used mechanical drum brakes with poor hydraulic proportioning between the front and rear axles. Because the truck was so light in the back, the rear wheels locked up first, every time. In a panic stop, that meant instant loss of control. The truck would pivot violently, skidding sideways across the road like a sled. On gravel or mud, that was just frightening. On asphalt, it was fatal. Many Willys pickups were found after wrecks laying on their sides or upside down, classic signs of loss of rear traction and overroll from oversteering. Rigid frame, zero protection. When those crashes occurred, survival was almost impossible. The Willys pickup used a rigid ladder frame, completely unyielding. There were no crumple zones, no energy absorption, nothing to cushion the blow. In a frontal collision, the impact traveled straight through the frame rails into the cab. The steering column was a solid steel spear aimed directly at the driver's chest. The dashboard was metal. The windshield didn't pop out, it shattered inward. And because the cab was so narrow, side impacts drove the doors inward like blades. Even at moderate speeds, collisions were lethal on impact. The truck didn't crumple, it simply stopped, and the human body paid the price. The false confidence of four-wheel drive. Willys advertised its pickup as an all-weather, all-terrain workhorse. The 4x4 system, borrowed from the military Jeep, gave it excellent traction on dirt. But that system bred overconfidence. Drivers believed that four-wheel drive meant safety, that it could handle anything. On loose terrain, that was partly true. But on wet pavement or icy hills, it was a death trap. Because of its short wheelbase and narrow stance, engaging 4x4 at speed actually made it more unstable. The front and rear axles fought each other, creating a jerky, unpredictable steering feel. Inexperienced drivers tried to correct the fishtailing by oversteering and rolled the truck instead. Many rollover fatalities were blamed on driver error, but the truth was the design set them up to fail. In rural communities, the Willys pickup gained a dark reputation. Farmers, miners, and delivery drivers who relied on it day after day spoke in hushed tones about its unpredictability. Local newspapers in the early 1950s occasionally reported freak accidents involving Willys trucks leaving the road or overturning on gentle curves. With insurance investigators, when pressed, they cited light rear weight distribution and improper braking performance. But Willys Overland was too small and too desperate to compete with Ford and Chevrolet to admit its faults. Instead, the company quietly shifted focus to the new Willys Aero sedans and military contracts, leaving the pickup's deadly legacy unacknowledged. By the 1952, U.S. highways were faster, smoother, and busier. Cars and trucks were routinely traveling at 50 to 70 miles per hour. But the Willys pickup was never designed for those speeds. Its suspension geometry, steering ratio, and weight distribution were still optimized for crawling over mud and rocks. When driven like a normal vehicle, especially by civilians expecting Jeep toughness, the truck turned into a rolling hazard. Brake fade on long descents, oversteer from a light rear end, rollover tendency from a tall center of gravity, zero protection from its steel cab construction. Simply put, it was a wartime design let loose in peacetime traffic, and people paid with their lives. Today, collectors cherish the 1952 Willys pickup for its nostalgia, its boxy good looks, its military heritage, its connection to the heroic Jeep lineage. But under that nostalgic glow lies the truth. This was a truck born for war, not for safety. It taught engineers an important and painful lesson. You can't build a civilian vehicle with military logic. A farm truck is not a battlefield tool. Speed and control matter more when lives are at stake. The 1952 Willys pickup stands as a grim reminder of the cost of misplaced faith in ruggedness. It was light, proud, and brave, but not safe. The Willys pickup represents a pivotal failure in post-war American automotive thinking. The belief that toughness equaled safety. Its creators believed a rigid frame and simple design would make it indestructible. They were right about the truck, but not about the people inside. In the end, the 1952 Willys pickup was indestructible only in the cruelest sense. It survived nearly every crash intact, while its driver rarely did. Number 3. 1956 Dodge C-Series pickup. Forward control, backward thinking. When Dodge unveiled the C-Series pickup in 1956, it was hailed as a bold, modern step forward. The forward control cab, where the driver sat almost on top of the front axle and inches from the engine, looked futuristic and maximized cargo space. But beneath that sleek, utilitarian exterior lurked a series of deadly flaws that turned an ordinary collision into a potential catastrophe. The forward control innovation and its fatal consequences. The forward control design placed the driver almost on top of the front suspension, with the engine, radiator, and firewall mere inches from the knees. This might have been acceptable at 25 miles per hour on a farm road, but on public highways traveling 50 to 60 miles per hour, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The cab structure had virtually no crumple zone. The firewall often folded inward, crushing the driver and passenger. The engine and radiator could breach the cab, sending hot metal and coolant directly onto the occupants. Even minor collisions frequently resulted in severe injuries, and serious accidents were often fatal. Occupant protection? What occupant protection? Safety in 1956 was an afterthought. The C-Series offered no seatbelts, rigid bench seats, a metal dashboard and steering column aimed directly at the driver. Combine these with the forward control layout, and even small impacts could drive the steering column into the chest or fold the cab roof down onto the heads of passengers. Mechanical design woes. The Dodge C-Series also suffered from mechanical vulnerabilities that made accidents more likely. The front suspension was extremely stiff to handle heavy loads, which caused violent jolts on uneven surfaces. Steering was heavy and imprecise, especially at higher speeds, increasing the likelihood of losing control. Brakes were drum-style, single-circuit, meaning one leak could remove all stopping power. When combined with the forward control cab's poor crash engineering, a simple panic stop could lead to catastrophic outcomes. The proximity of the engine, radiator, and fuel system to the cab created another deadly problem: fire. In several documented incidents, the engine block or radiator was driven into the cabin during collisions. Fuel lines were ruptured, igniting gasoline. Occupants trapped by the folded cab often suffered fatal burns before emergency responders could reach them. Dozens of fatalities were reported specifically from post-crash fires, making the C-Series one of the most dangerous pickup designs of the 1950s. The Dodge C-Series pickup was marketed as a modern, space-efficient work truck, ideal for small businesses and tradesmen. But its design was a cruel paradox. The features that maximized cargo capacity, forward control, compact cab, directly compromised human safety. Unlike conventional pickups of the era where the engine provided some buffer in frontal collisions, the C-Series put the driver on the front line, inches from the point of impact. The C-Series pickup teaches us a grim but vital lesson. Innovative design without safety foresight is deadly. Forward control might have been revolutionary for load space, but it ignored the physics of crashes and the vulnerability of the human body. Rigid, non-crumbling metal in the path of a collision? Fatal. Fuel and engine proximity? Recipe for fires. Lack of restraint systems? Guaranteed that the driver bore the brunt of any impact. The result is a truck that worked for cargo, but killed its crew in the process. Today, the 1956 Dodge C-Series pickup is admired for its styling, innovative layout, and historical significance in the evolution of cab design. Number 2. 1957 Ford Ranchero, the first car-truck hybrid gone wrong. In 1957, Ford introduced the Ranchero, a revolutionary idea at the time, a vehicle that combined the comfort of a passenger car with the utility of a pickup truck. The concept was brilliant on paper. The Ranchero let suburban and rural buyers haul light loads without giving up the driving experience of a full-sized sedan. But brilliance in concept did not equal brilliance in execution. Design innovations and fatal oversights. The 1957 Ranchero was based on a unibody design derived from the Ford Fairline. While unibody construction reduced weight and manufacturing cost, it also introduced a major structural weakness. The rear of the vehicle was designed to carry cargo, but the unibody lacked sufficient reinforcement for heavy or dynamic loads. Leaf springs supporting the rear often sheared at the shackles under stress, especially when loaded or during high-speed maneuvers. This could cause the rear end to collapse or swing sideways, throwing the vehicle into uncontrolled spins and often into oncoming traffic. Effectively, drivers were navigating a hybrid vehicle that Ford had never engineered to survive real-world stress or speed. Handling, a recipe for disaster. The Ranchero's handling betrayed its dual identity: car-like front suspension with heavy front end, truck-like rear suspension that was rigid but weakly attached. The combination produced twitchy, unpredictable behavior, particularly when loaded. At speeds above 50 miles per hour, the vehicle understeered at first, then oversteered violently. Leaf spring failures could trigger sudden fishtailing, giving drivers no time to react. Emergency braking often made the unibody twist and buckle, worsening control loss. In essence, the Ranchero was neither a car nor a truck in terms of safe handling. Occupant safety minimal at best. Like most vehicles of the late 1950s, the Ranchero offered virtually no safety features. Rigid steering column directly in line with the driver's chest, solid metal dashboard with no padding, no seat belts, no crumple zones, no head restraints. Even minor crashes could result in serious injury or death, while a high-speed incident with cargo on board could tear the rear end off entirely, making fatalities almost inevitable. The car-truck paradox. The 1957 Ranchero highlights a key lesson in automotive engineering. Hybrid vehicles must account for both identities. Ford created a lightweight car front for comfort, a cargo-capable truck rear for utility, but neglected the physics of combining the two safely. The result? A vehicle that looked innovative and practical, but punished drivers who pushed it past a leisurely 50 miles per hour. The Ranchero went on to become a cultural icon and spawned multiple generations, eventually improving in safety and reliability. But the 1957 model serves as a cautionary tale. Innovation without structural integrity is deadly. Hybrid concepts require safety engineering for both purposes. Early adopters of car-truck designs were effectively test subjects in a mobile experiment. The 1957 Ford Ranchero was the world's first car-truck hybrid, and a warning that some experiments on wheels should be approached with extreme caution. Number 1. 1958 Studebaker Transtar. Futuristic look, fatal handling. In 1958, Studebaker introduced the Transtar, a bold step into the world of modern truck design. With its futuristic styling, including a tall cab, wrap-around windshield, and clean body lines, it looked like a truck ahead of its time. A vehicle for the modern farmer or small business owner who wanted both style and utility. But beneath the sleek exterior lurked a dangerous reality. The Transtar was extremely unstable, especially under real-world driving conditions. Design choices. Form over function. Several design elements contributed to the Transtar's deadly reputation. Tall cab height. The cab sat much higher than most pickups of the era, raising the center of gravity. While this offered excellent road visibility, it made the truck prone to tipping in turns or during evasive maneuvers. Railing short wheelbase. The distance between the front and rear axles was relatively short, amplifying the truck's tendency to pitch and yaw. Combined with the tall cab, this created a vehicle that was light and twitchy in the rear, especially under load. Narrow track width. The narrow stance increased the risk of rollovers during high-speed turns or crosswinds, particularly when the truck was towing a trailer or carrying cargo. Real-world consequences. The TranStar's handling flaws were more than theoretical. Drivers often lost control on open highways, especially in windy conditions. The truck was prone to jackknife events when towing, where the trailer would swing violently, dragging the cab off its intended path. Emergency maneuvers often caused sudden rollovers because the rear end would step out unexpectedly due to poor suspension tuning. In short, what looked like a modern, stylish pickup was a rolling test of survival for its operators. Occupant safety. Like most 1950s trucks, the TranStar offered virtually no safety features. Rigid steering column could impale drivers in frontal collisions. Minimal cabin reinforcement meant the cab could collapse during rollovers. No seatbelts or crumple zones amplified the consequences of any accident. Even slow-speed mishaps could become lethal, while high-speed incidents often ended tragically for both driver and passengers. Lessons from the TranStar. The 1958 Studebaker TranStar serves as a cautionary tale in automotive design. Aesthetic innovation cannot replace structural safety. High cabs with short wheelbases are inherently unstable, especially when towing. Utility vehicles require engineering that anticipates real-world stresses, not just looks. The TranStar proved that futuristic design and driver ambition do not guarantee survival. Sometimes they invite disaster.